Are we good? There it is. I wondered if I'd missed it. That was pretty good, on cue. Well, good afternoon. My name is Wendy Hudson. I'm the owner and current custodian of the two independent bookstores on the island, Mitchell's Book Corner and Nantucket Bookworks, both of which have been serving the island for over 50 years, and me for 27 of those, which I find a little shocking. But before I introduce our speakers, I hope you'll indulge me in three big thanks that I want to give and not mess it up. First, on behalf of everyone involved with the Nantucket Book Foundation, let me express our great appreciation to our staff, our volunteers, and our generous sponsors at every level. Second, on behalf of the bookstores, I want to give a big shout out to our cadre of booksellers in the stores that are so busy this weekend, as well as our bookselling volunteers, most especially Percy Sutton. I call them our book power couple, Percy Sutton and Mike Katz, who have been volunteering with the book schlepping since Festival 1, and they never get quite enough thanks, so thank you for letting me thank them. Finally, on a more personal note, I just want to say how meaningful it's been feeling over the last couple of days to gather in person again. I'm a little surprised at how moved I am by that. So thank you for every one of you for actually coming in person. It's like it's become a little bit more of an act of risk than we ever thought it used to be. So that's worth acknowledging and thanking you. Last night's presentations, particularly I want to say Azar Nafisi's, contained powerful and provocative statements about the crucial role of literature in free society. And our next presenters are journalistic luminaries that perfectly continue those themes that she mentioned. They have made it their life's work to shine light and try to make sense of the most pressing issues of our time. Peter Osnos, the author of An Especially Good View. I'm a bookseller, so I had to bring the props. And we'll be selling the books afterward if I forget to mention that right outside, and they'll be signing. An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen. And to quote myself in my advocate piece for the book, I said, "This page-turner of an autobiography chronicles one of the most fascinating careers imaginable in journalism and publishing," and that is an understatement, I guarantee you. From a reporting career with I.F. Stone to the Washington Post to his publishing career at Times Books, Public Affairs, and most recently Platform Books, Peter has had a front row seat for history and has worked with everyone from Donald Trump to Barack Obama and everyone in between. Read the book, you will love it. His son, Evan Osnos, learned at Peter's heels, and he's taken the balls off and running. Evan is a staff writer at The New Yorker, a frequent CNN contributor, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. His first book, Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China, won the National Book Award, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His most recent book, Wild Land, The Making of America's Fury, is required reading for those of us trying to understand the roots of current shifts in our society. Read it too. On one last note, continuing our theme of this weekend's BookFest theme of connections, it's my great honor today to confess a great connection to Peter and Evan Osnos, that we had the good sense to all be part of the same family. So on behalf, please join me in welcoming Peter and Evan Osnos. Thank you for being here.
Hello. Oh, good. Can you hear me? I just want, before we start, psst. So she revealed the secret that she's a first cousin once removed. But I want you all to know that Wendy is truly a superstar in the world of books and publishing. She really is. I mean, I know you see her stores, but publishing is an environment, and she is really remarkably important. The nature of the books, the nature of the stores, and if you don't believe me, Publishers Weekly just said that this year. So let's do it for Wendy.
Here, here. All right, well, thank you all for coming today. As you can imagine, it's kind of a treat for me to be able to have a conversation about books and writing and reading with my dear dad. And, you know, I've often thought a lot over the years that if he was a fishmonger, I'd be selling fish. I mean, this is just the way that things work, and it is a real privilege and an education to have grown up around the kind of dinner table conversation that we had. I don't know if most people grew up learning about the challenges of marketing with Barnes & Noble, but it's for a certain kind of mind and an author, it's been like second nature to me. My dad often said, buildings are, he said, books are better than buildings because no matter what happens to your book, nobody can tear it down. And so those were the kinds of things that I grew up with just as an idea of what it means to be a writer. And we're both here talking about a couple of our books, and in a way that I think you'll hear in a moment, they're both mysteries of a certain kind. They were both motivated by a sense of pursuit, of trying to answer a question we didn't know how to answer at the outset. In my dad's case, his book, which is a reported memoir, and you'll hear a bit about what that means, is an attempt to try to answer questions both internal and external about the interplay between the events of a life and a mind and how those two relate to one another. And in my case, I was trying to answer the question I think a lot of us are trying to answer, which is how did this country get quite so divided in so many ways, and what might we do now to get past it? But that was the motivating impulse. There are some books where you start with the answer and then you build in what happens before, and in this case we were both starting with a question. And so I want to start, Dad, if I can, with the question of the title itself, An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen. And explain, if you could, why that title. You could have called it many, many things. There are a lot of wonderful stories in the book. Why that?
Well, good question.
Thank you
Good
very
question.
much. Thank you.
Excellent. I mean, I'm stunned.
We've never met.
No,
This
no,
is
no,
quite
and
a-
we've never discussed titles, ever. The purpose of it is that what I discovered, the origin of my memoir, speaking of which comes at the back of the room, if you want to turn around briefly, some of the most I shouldn't have said that.
He's
Oliver
pointing out the
Rose.
next generation of
Pointing out the
readers and
next
writers in our
generation of
family
writers,
who are
and
now going to...
I was warned not to do that.
That's my Rosie and Al.
All right.
Anyway, that's
So,
enough of that.
The origin was a grandson, Benjamin, not these guys, but my older grandson, Benjamin, said to me one day a few years ago, he said, well, for a school project, tell me the story of your family in World War II. But I said, Ben, it's our family. And that's when I realized that it was essential for me to find out the story of our family. I knew some legends, one does, but I didn't know the details. The first chapter of my book, after the introduction, is called Caste Polish. Now you say, why is that? Because I was born in India in 1943. My parents were Poles. The war started, and they made it one way or another to India by 1940, and 4 years later, I was born, and we all left they left on a troop ship with me in a basket. And we came to the United States. They were already sort of late 30s, about to be 40, starting over. So while we have the same DNA, in many ways we were strangers. Because I grew up in one universe, and they had grown up and lived and survived in another. So the purpose of the book was to find out what their world was, to understand what their world had been, and to be able to share it not only with readers, but with folks who come along, like Evan. Because Evan, until we went to Poland together in 2002, because one of my cousins, our cousins, won a book award, he was living in a completely different universe. So it turned out that because it started there, that was always my way of seeing the world, as something to observe. And of course, if you're a journalist, that's how you make your living. So I've always been observing, and as you'll see in the book, one story after another is told from the point of view of being there, but also watching it. And I came to understand that that's what journalists do. So we don't really have the full, and I certainly didn't have it with my folks, the full emotional impact of what it meant to be them, but now I know what they went through.
You, as a young reporter, you've Wendy mentioned you worked for I.F. Stone, and then eventually you got to the Washington Post, sort of as a baby reporter, and then they sent you to Vietnam. And in the book, I think you describe Vietnam as shaping your understanding of a lot of things: politics, human nature, and storytelling. I'm especially interested in those latter two things. How did the experience of covering the war in Vietnam shape your sense of human nature and storytelling?
We obviously don't have the time to do it today, but you should know that I went to Vietnam, and 30 years later, Evan went to Iraq. Then I went to the Soviet Union, and he went to China. War, autocracy. We both ended up in Washington, 30 years apart. So there is a kind of way to parallel our experiences and to be able to test the difference in the generations. Vietnam, as we all know, was a catastrophe in the American culture. I ended up being, among other things, the editor for Robert McNamara's In Retrospect, the book in which he confronted this and wrote about it and tried to explain what happened. But on the ground, those of us who got there, and that's where I met my wife, Susan, this little young lady here.
Lucky for me, I should point out.
Yeah. We could see what was happening. We knew what was happening, but we were not sent there as ideologues. When Ben Bradley said to me, age 26, Osnos, go to Vietnam, he didn't say, what's your view of the war? He didn't say, what are your politics? Even knowing that I had worked for Izzy Stone, who was, after all, thought to be a radical. Never asked me that. He only had one question. Will you go? Will you write your heart out? Will you make us, whatever the word is, look good? So that's how I got to Vietnam, and I did come to understand that Vietnam was an American catastrophe. And it wasn't a catastrophe of evil, although it had many evil elements. But remember, at the end of World War II, anti-communism was the driving force of politics. And none of those guys, Kennedy in particular, Johnson, McNamara, could imagine losing to the communists. And that was the tragedy. The storytelling part is, and this is going to be very important, I think, in how Evan's writing works. Our job was not to argue, our job was to narrate and to attempt to persuade. So that was it. And I came home after 2 years there. I'm not a war junkie. I never covered another war. But obviously being in a war and seeing all the things that war means makes an indelible impression and gives you an understanding of conflicts that are lasting.
You then had another experience that was kind of central to the American 20th century, which was you went off to the Soviet Union for the Washington Post, and you were covering the Post. I was born while we were there, not in Moscow. I think obstetrics in the mid-'70s was not sufficiently attractive, so my folks went to London, and where I was born. And at one point while you were in Moscow, Bob Bernstein, who was running Random House, came over. He was also involved in human rights work, and one of the things he said was, hey, you know, journalism's not a business fit for a grown man, so if you ever want to get a real job, call me. And by the way, I quibble with that now that I'm 45, but you did call him, and that's what brought you into book publishing, and I'm curious what that experience was like to go from being a reporter and a writer to being an editor, and what did you have to learn that you didn't know?
Footnote, the reason why he was not born in London, not born in Moscow, and his sister was not born in Moscow, was a report by one of the senior women in the embassy on what it was like to have a baby in Moscow. Let me just share with you the one word: leeches. London.
A word that probably hasn't been uttered in this room in a long time.
The thing about it was, Bob was an extraordinary character, and he was the chairman of Random House at a time when in New York publishing, which by today's standards seems almost quaint, it was an immensely important institution. And it was Knopf and Random House and Dr. Seuss and James Michener. But he wanted and was interested in a kind of nonfiction that I think everybody remembers. Today, this is the weekend of the 50th anniversary of Watergate and All the President's Men. And in many ways, if you're looking at the history of modern journalism, in some respects, that's when it came about, that kind of narrative. And he wanted someone who was in a position to write those kinds of books. And fortunately, I have a spouse who was willing to do it, and she went to work for Helsinki Watch, later Human Rights Watch. And so that's how we came to New York, and that's where we started telling Evan and his sister Catherine what was important in life.
All right, I'll ask one other question, which is about the publishing industry. You've sort of been a part of it now for more than 3 decades, and I do remember one observation that you've made, Dad, which is that the first book ever published was Gutenberg's Bible, and the second book ever published was called Publishing is Dying. And yet here we are, and it is still going, and we're all fortunate and grateful for that. What's your sense of how the publishing industry is doing and how it has managed to escape that prognosis over and over again?
Well, first point was the one I made at the outset. The bookstores that you have here are not just bookstores, they're really major parts of the community, and you all identify with that. One of the things that we learned in the last 25 years in particular is that you moved from the notion that books could only be obtained if you went into a bookstore, asked for them. If they had it, they would give it to you. If not, they would order it. And there was what was in people's minds is the line of, I'll see if I can get Evan's book. Well, that's an obstacle. And what's happened over the last 25 years is that the psychology has begun to change for all kinds of reasons. Some of them not necessarily in the interest of independent booksellers. But the way it works now is, the phrase that I kind of came up with is, good books, any way you want them, now. So if you decide that you want a book, print, 70% of books are in print, which is a remarkable fact. 20% are ebooks, and 10% are audio, and that's the largest and fastest growing part of the business. And the reason, and this is my sort of surmise based on experience, the reason why publishing is done as well as it has is because of that fact. In a person's mind now, I can get it. I don't have to obtain it. See the difference? And so books, because they are so deeply embedded, after all, for 500 years, or actually all the way back to cave paintings, it's just that the iteration of them, the way they're presented, has changed. And I think that's an essential part of why books, which at their core are always going to be content. Content is eternal. Distribution is what evolves. Other than that, I have no opinions.
Now, this is the part where you start to lavish easy, generous questions on me.
Evan, what was I like as a father? No, I mean...
Well, I've brought a visual presentation, actually.
So, actually, I'm in Washington, or increasingly over the years, in the last few years, people will start by saying to me, Osnos. Evan Osnos' his father? yeah, that. I must be very proud. Well, what do you think? It's just amazing to watch a person, young man, evolve in the way that Evan has as a writer. And one of the things that has been striking to me is that he started in the newspaper business as I did. He was at the Chicago Tribune. When people no longer can really appreciate the degree to which the Chicago Tribune, in the middle of the country, really was an important newspaper and had the wit to give a very long list. You can talk about that a little bit. And then he went to the New Yorker. And he'd been to the New Yorker since 2008. And what is the New Yorker? Talk to us about, because the New Yorker, both books, Age of Ambition, Wildland, and by the way, Evan had written so much about Joe Biden in the magazine that after Biden was nominated, we were sitting in our place in Michigan. I said, Evan, you got a week. Oh, he put together the Biden book, which became the book that sold all over the world because no one all over the world knew who Biden was. So Eva's a narrative writer. So talk about the strength of the New Yorker, the reason why you think, how many people here subscribe? I rest my case. And the other question is, how many of you think or know you subscribe to Fox News? You all subscribe to Fox News if you have cable.
So your question is about the New Yorker. I think the truth is, I've been at the New Yorker now 14 years, and it is a little bit of a case of, asking a fish to describe water. I'm like the worst person to be able to describe it because it's all I know now. But I have this, there are, at the New Yorker, there are sort of a couple of tribes internally. One of them is the MFA, Iowa Writers Tribe, people who came up in the writing world, particularly in fiction or in thinking about literary criticism, and then came over to the New Yorker. And then there's the other tribe, which is people who came up in the business of sort of traditional journalism, newspapering. David Remnick, who runs the magazine, is a guy who came out of the Washington Post. And the thing that's interesting is that getting those two tribes to speak a common language is an art because they are slightly different ways of thinking about it. Sarah Beth and I were talking the other night, my wife and I were talking about how, in some sense, the New Yorker has these two kind of hidden texts. One is about artfulness and one is about powerfulness. And if you can kind of get both of them onto the page at the same time, there's something magic about it because people respond to it. You can read about power on the pages of the newspaper all day long, and you might read about art in the pages of The Right Place to Go. But when you can get those two together, it's something else. But in the end, the truth is that the thing about the New Yorker is that a lot of what we read and experience in public culture and in reading culture is about one person announcing a point of view and kind of bashing you over the head with it as much as possible. The New Yorker thing, I will say, is slightly subtler. The goal is, and this is probably bad of me to do, I'm giving away the secret sauce, but the goal of every reported New Yorker piece, and this applies to the books that a lot of us write, is to get the reader through detail, the sort of accretion of detail and right up to the point of announcing what the author actually thinks without saying it. If you say it, the spell is gone, you've broken it, it's no fun. If you get the reader right up to the point where they send you an email in which they say, here's what I think that piece was about, and if they say what you were trying to do, then you say, okay, that worked. But the whole thing is it's about withholding, because what you're trying to do is just avoid being explicit. And one last thing about the reporting, look, in the end, the reporting is kind of actually a bit crazy. I mean, the level of depth that people go to in reporting is often, the goal is to try to see the world through the eyes of another person that you're writing about. And very often, the most useful question in a New Yorker interview is simply to say, tell me more. Because you actually are not very often sort of pushing it. But I will just say one thing, which is a colleague of mine once said that really she only knows when she's achieved the right level of depth for serious narrative storytelling when she has seen her subject with wet hair. Because it implies that you've moved into their life so much that they're no longer self-conscious about your presence. And I think there's something to that, actually.
Wet hair. I just wanted to say that when Susan and I happened to be in Beijing when Ev submitted his first piece, which was about a Chinese boxer. No Chinese had ever won a gold medal in boxing at the Olympics, and this was 2008. Ev wanted to write about boxing. He pitched the piece to the New Yorker, and the line from Remnick was, the bar for boxing stories in the New Yorker is very high.
Well, and what somebody said to me, they said, hey, pro tip, never pitch stories on stuff the boss writes about. I was like, I'm right now.
He's written the biography of Muhammad Ali. So And that was, in a sense, the breakthrough. And, not everybody can write for the New Yorker.
But I do have to tell the unfortunate story of what happened with that piece, which is, it ends fine in the end. I'm there 14 years later. But I submitted this piece, and they basically wrote back and they said, that's not great. And the reason why, and this is a really brilliant observation of my editor at the time, was he said, I'm just going to go out on a limb here. Have you been sort of going out and reading everything you possibly can about great literary writing on boxing? And I was like, yes! And he's like, don't do that. I was like, I've been reading Liebling, I've been reading Joyce Carol Oates, I could recite it chapter and verse. And he's like, yeah, don't do that. Just write your own story and leave the literature aside. You've absorbed it enough now. And that was essential. I went back and kind of reimagine what that story could be, and lucky for me, and here we are. So.
Let me tell you one more thing about Evan in that story. So they send him this. We're visiting, as it just happens. We're visiting Beijing, Susan and I. And he sends this piece in, and obviously gets back this, we go about our business. Next thing I know, he's in there, he's typing away, tapping away, sends the piece in. 24 hours later, the editor writes back, Evan, you nailed it.
I have to say, I was not necessarily prepared for things to go well, though. I bought a book on preparing to take the GMATs. That was plan B.
But what was extraordinary about it, and I remember this as not only as a father, but as a writer, that he'd gotten really kicked hard when they sent the piece back to him. And I know David Remnick has told me since, well, I wasn't sure this kid was going to make it. You nailed it, and he's been nailing it there ever since. So, Ev, we got to beat up on each other here.
Right.
What are you going to, the truth is, journalism in today's world is fraught for all kinds of reasons. We're fraught because of the nature of the business model, which is complicated. We're fraught because of the nature of the subject matter. There are people who are saying, I just can't bear to, I stopped reading the news. It's just too grim, the relentlessness of it, that everything is going wrong. So let's talk for a minute before presumably we go to questions, if there are any. Where do you see this pattern that we have, what I call kind of reflexive negativity? Where do we go in order to begin? That's Wildlands,
Right.
Ultimately, or upside at the end. Where do we go? How do we restore some sense of positive belief?
Well, I think, part of the challenge as a journalist, and I do think there are sort of solutions to this, but part of the structural arrangement of journalism is that we are trained, and this goes all the way back to here we are on the 50th anniversary of Watergate, we're trained to think of ourselves as being necessarily skeptical. And if an institution tells you one thing, your job is not to take it at face value, but to say, all right, here's the ways in which this is hiding something, or that it's being providing a self-serving interpretation. And that is, of course, part of the job. Comforting the afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. That is part of the project. And yet, at the same time, in a way, like any system, I think over time, journalism is a tradition and a culture, and it kind of passed down from one generation to the next. And as it goes, it becomes more distilled. And there are commercial incentives to want to be more conflictual. It's, if you can go on and, I say this, I know this from experience. If you go on to talk about a subject and you say, I have the bombshell criticism of this thing that might look good, that is a naturally more commercially viable thing to do. The problem, of course, is over time, we end up focusing almost relentlessly on what's going wrong instead of sometimes focusing on what's going right. And I can tell you, very often when you do write about something that is going right, a project that is achieving the desired benefits or something, the reaction from readers is extraordinary. People are just like, this is like water in the desert. I know, I see it in my own community that things are working in some ways, but I don't know why I don't see that when I turn on the TV.
Part of this has to do, I think, with the nationalization of our information culture. I mean, if you walk out with one statistic today, it's extraordinary, which is that, in 1976, the year I was born, if you compare the number of people who could tell you who their governor is to the number of people in 2007 who could tell you who their governor is, that number has been cut in half. And part of that is because as, local news, and by the way, but the same number of people can still tell you who the vice president and the president are. So there's a way in which we have all receded from our local culture and have sort of uploaded more and more of our mental lives to this nationalized political conversation and conversation generally. And that very often ends up adhering to the contours of this kind of bias towards criticism rather than acknowledging what's working. If you look at the data, it's very clear these days. People will say, the national scene is completely screwed up, but actually, in my neighborhood, this is working pretty well. And even though my neighbor and I may not agree, we're actually working together on this common project, and this is going really. So one of the things that's happening that's kind of thrilling is that there is this effort to try to revive local institutions. We're in a place right now that has a lot of thriving local institutions. So this is, there are a lot of places that are trying to Nantucketize themselves. It's not always going to work, but one of the ways you do that is by making sure that you have a functioning local news organization, making sure that people are, not bowling alone in the old sense of what we mean by that. But that, I think, is part of the reason why we have this feeling sometimes that it's always every day is a hurricane or every day is a disaster.
What Evan's not saying is that his wife, Sarah Beth, who's occupied elsewhere at the moment, is the president, CEO of something called the American Journalism Project, which is an enormous effort to reinvent nonprofit journalism around the country. They have given grants now to 110 startup journalism projects around the country. I think one of the things that we both can agree on, that yes, the base is always going to be fraught. But if we didn't have the capacity to learn from what goes on, we wouldn't be here. I certainly would not be here if it hadn't been for the nature of his grandparents, my parents. And most of us come from somewhere. And I think that there is something in the American core which will face what we've got, and eventually we will figure out how to deal with it. We have to feel that way. There's no other option. So on that festive note,
yeah, let's.
Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask? Because we could probably answer it. And if not, I'll ask him another question. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I was thinking while I was listening to you two, it's Father's Day tomorrow. Yeah. You obviously have a warm and strong father-son relationship. And you mentioned Robert McNamara. And I think you said that you had edited his book.
In retrospect.
And he did not have a good relationship.
Well, I actually, are you going to ask about Craig McNamara's book? The one that was just published? Yeah, ask the question. You notice he tells his father what to do. What's the question?
Well, how do you explain the difference between your relationship and Robert McNamara's and his son's relationship?
Well,
Should we restate the question if people didn't hear?
Sure.
So the question was, we have this warm relationship, strong relationship. Robert McNamara, who wrote a book that my dad published called In Retrospect, did not have a strong relationship with his son, Craig McNamara. And the question is, what explains the difference between
Well, the reason I interrupted you is because there's a brand new book by Craig McNamara, Bob's son, called Because Our Fathers Lied. And it's his version of history. And I'm telling you, because we really don't want to waste a whole lot of time on it, he had a very intense relationship with his father, much more than you might imagine. It was love, deep love, and it was also his father's role in the war made him crazy. And let's face it, we don't have that problem. So I think that's really, in a sense, the answer. And Bob told me, and this is really interesting, when I read Craig McNamara's book, which is just out. It just, Little Brown published it, it's just out, and he's been on the air and all that. I went and looked at, in retrospect, to see how Bob dealt with his family. There were 3 references. And the first reference is, I'm not going to talk about my family. They were already carried enough. In the end, when Craig was starting a walnut farm in California, which is a great success, it was Bob who paid for it. So these things are complicated, and they're especially complicated in relationships like that. So is that the good answer? And I'm sorry for interrupting. I've never done that before, ever.
I'm looking to get into the walnut business, Dad. I've been meaning to talk.
Any other questions? Michael's back there's got a question.
Well, you were talking, Evan, you were talking about the accretion of details at the New Yorker, and you have both accreted an enormous amount of details, and we're also talking about the wish for hopeful news. And Evan, you have been recently covering everything from gun culture to a lot of dark sides of America. My hope is that maybe among those details you have hit on some things that have actually given you hope if we can magnify those details and spread around.
Yeah.
Can either of you give me an example from your accretion of details?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Thanks to Michael for that. For people who didn't hear, the question is, we talked about the accretion of detail, and there is this sense that I've been covering a lot of dark elements of the American moment, but is there something that does give me hope? And the answer is emphatically yes, actually. I mean, I will give you one curious example that may surprise you. I spent a lot of time in West Virginia. It was one of the places I write about in this book, and it's the first place I went into. I got some journalism experience. Was this little tiny newspaper in West Virginia, and West Virginia is a prime example of a place in which people have kind of evacuated the local political scene and just moved entirely into this national thing. You're either on Team A or Team B, and that's it. And it feels very static. And then there was this other project that happened a few years ago. Some young Democrats basically said, we're not going to make any headway here if we start going door to door and saying to people, hi, I'm a Democrat. I'd like to get you involved in politics. West Virginia wasn't really interested in that. But they said, all right, well, what if we just go door to door? We say we're calling ourselves a coalition. We're not partisan. We're just West Virginia can't wait. Can't wait any longer for people to fix problems for us. We can't wait any longer for things to kind of mend themselves. And they said, we're going to accept Democrats, we're going to accept Republicans, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And they said, if we can get 10 or 20 people to run for office under this flag of West Virginia can't wait, that'll be a success. They ended up getting 79 people who were interested in doing this, putting aside the kind of partisan label and saying, I'm willing to take a chance on the idea that we have things that are common problems. Meaning in West Virginia, it's stuff like the fact that the water is polluted and the fact that it doesn't matter if you're blue or red, you care about that issue. And they ended up breaking the record for the number of small donations that any candidate has ever gotten in the history of West Virginia gubernatorial politics. They got something like 2,000 individual donations, and the sitting governor got 19. So they tapped into something. And that's an idea that I find actually quite able, you could replicate it in a lot of other places. You just have to be willing to say, I'm going to put aside the thing that we sometimes announce most immediately, which is our tribal identity.
Which reminds me that Evan's sister, Catherine, is a middle school social studies teacher in Marin County in a little tiny town, which Evan once said, if the fire ever gets there, the smell of marijuana is going to be intense. So
they will be slow-moving evacuees.
So that the kids are, from that culture. And what Catherine has done every year with these kids is she tells them at the beginning of the year that at the end of the year, you're going to stand up and deliver a TED Talk about your change project. What you're going to do and what you've been doing all year in your change project. And it's an amazing thing to watch. Those boys and girls, they're 14. None of them are particularly comfortable. But they are all trying to do something worthwhile in the community. And it's on YouTube. Her name is Catherine Sanford, if you want to go see it. The point is, that's where you can look at something and say, I feel better. And that's where you can look at something. Change projects. So there you go. And we have time, I think, for one more question over here. Ma'am? You have to speak up very loud because you're in a corner.
So you talked about how networks don't like to publish news unless it's going to get those dollars and get people to tune in. But I think we all are desperate to hear the good news, and you had that response to that article that was positive. So what do you think is the barrier to getting a news network who's going to report some of the change that's happening, some of the positive things? I mean, is it economics only? I mean, how can we move that dial?
Capitalism. Look, it's very simple. And Michael Hill is here, and he's written the Art Bookworld biography. And I mentioned this to you yesterday, Michael, that Art Bookworld wrote for Katharine Graham a line that she used at one of her birthday parties. And it's appropriate this weekend. She said, "The Washington Post is Woodward and Bernstein. The Washington Post is Woodward and Lothrop, the downtown department store." What you had was an economy in journalism based on advertising. And when the advertising model began to decline and has, in the print sense, collapsed, you had a necessity to engage your reader through subscriptions and through engagement and all that other business. And it's become, in a sense, a national practice of looking at the traffic accidents.
I will say a couple of things. I mean, as a practitioner, we do respond to feedback. So if there are letters coming in that say, "Hey, I love that story about somebody doing this thing really well," somebody who was demonstrating mastery or civic engagement or generosity of spirit, if you loved a piece, it's worth writing to the news organization and saying, "That was a great story," because that does matter. I mean, obviously we respond to the metrics of who's clicking on what and so on, but spread the word. I think this is a case of, there are these what are known as collective illusions, where we all assume that we think a certain thing until somebody punctures it and says the opposite, and everybody says, "Oh yeah, I actually agree with you." And I think the bias towards negative news is actually one of those things, that on some level, a lot of us are saying, I really do get a lot out of reading. And it's not Pollyanna-ish to write or read a story that says about a mayor in a town who is doing a bunch of smart things, and it's not fundamentally about conflict, it's fundamentally about creating something, and saying, "I'm rewarding that as a reader and a buyer," that helps, that matters. So in the same way that we say, call your congressman, call your editor and say, "I like that piece."
The New Yorker style, and the style of, I would say, journalism and narrative that I have been publishing and writing over myself for the years, and Evan certainly does, and the New Yorker does, is you don't necessarily have to argue. You don't necessarily have to be shrill and polemicize, but you do have to be persuasive in a narrative way. And if you can persuade in a narrative way, you can do a hell of a lot more than if you just demand that people agree with you. And that's really a problem. And it's now 12:45, and I guess we have to. What?
All right.
Do one more, if there is one more.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I have a substantive question that I can't resist asking you. Given your work in Russia and yours in China, do you see Russia and China forming some kind of grand alliance to stand up to the United States? There's some hints of that, and I wondered if you have a combined view on that.
I'll give you a sense of, we'll both have a thought, I think, but there's two layers to that relationship from the Chinese perspective. At the presidential level, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin do have a kind of bromance. They are born within a few months of each other. They do have a shared experience of both looking at the 20th century and saying that the greatest catastrophe, I mean, that's Putin's word, and also Xi Jinping has indicated the same sense, that the great catastrophe was the collapse of the Soviet Union. They view that as a failure of history. And so these days, they find themselves having a lot of kind of situational alliances. It's in a way, they do see themselves as standing up against this Western behemoth. And yet, and I think every person who spends a lot of time in China would agree with this, that there is beneath that profound suspicion and skepticism. The Chinese and the Russians have been neighbors way too long to be friends. And there is this really embedded sense in the Chinese perception of the Russians that the Russians have always looked down on them. The Soviets were very kind of patronizing, and Chinese hated it. And now that there is a certain amount of great pleasure on the Chinese part, that they look at Russia and they say, it's a lovely little economy you've got there, the size of New York State. You know, we're just going to go ahead and do things our way. But they have this, for the moment, yeah, there is this, they have reasons to be aligned, but it's not deep. It's much more dependent on the current circumstances.
The thing we now know about Russia and China, particularly from my experience with Russia, the line I've been using lately is you can take communism out of Russia, but you can't take Russia out of Russia. And what you are seeing in this invasion of Ukraine and a whole sort of Putin calling himself Peter the Great and all that business is certain things that were deeply ingrained in Russia. Communism, the years of the Soviet Union, were not something that was out of the norm in the great history of Russia. And it was just another iteration of it. What you're seeing in Putin today is very much in the tradition of Russian history. Two things. One is they have grievance. They believe they're a great state, and they believe that they are not appreciated as a great state. The second thing that they have is the goddamn Russian army, which is just keeps going. I don't think China and Russia are going to be ever like this. As I've said, I mean, they are neighbors, they're not friends. Their systems are not, one is in fact a system of ideological affinity to something, and the other really is just what it is now, Russia. So I don't think they really have it. But I do think that the dangers are vast. It will only take one really bad mistake somewhere, and we'll be in very, very great trouble.
I think we have time for one last question right here, because I called on it.
Are you going to collaborate on a book?
Absolutely not. Absolutely. He circles around me.
No, I mean, you have an idea. Thank you, folks.
Yeah.
Very much.
Thank you. Wait a minute. Wait.
Just a Nantucket New Yorker comment. The New Yorker does not write about pro sports, particularly pro football. You will not find a Super Bowl story in the New Yorker, but you will find Rogers E.M. Whitaker's story about Nantucket's championship year.
Hear, hear. I love it. That's excellent. Good note to end on. Thank you.